we will be speaking about a proper strategy, how to go about attempting a paper like CAT. Now, I very well understand when I am appearing for CAT, I am working under two major constraints. The first constraint is to clear the sectional cutoff. The second constraint is the overall cutoff. Now, it is very important to understand when I am working under these two constraints, I cannot just attempt the paper in any as I feel like. There has to be a proper approach or a strategy. Now, the entire session for today is going to be based on how you can maybe devise a proper way of going about attempting the paper and try to maximize your score. Now, if I know that I am just looking at last year's pattern, that CAT comprises of two sections. The first section is QA and DI, and the second section is English and LR. So, these are the two sections. If I am going by the pattern of last year, this is section 1, this is section 2. You have about 30 questions in each section, and you have 70 minutes for each. Now, it is very important to understand that whenever you are starting off a paper or a section, it is very vital to ensure that you feel positive about the paper right from the beginning. Let us just take an example. Suppose you started off a test paper, you attempted the first question and somehow you could not solve it. You go to question number 2, you find that it is a bit maybe tough. Question number 3, maybe it looks a bit unfamiliar. By the time you reach question number 4, you start planning for CAT next year. The reason is that you had a bad start. Now, you simply cannot afford to have this kind of a start. In fact, a lot of people give up their hopes right after the first 10 to 15 minutes. That is because they have had a bad start. So, it is important for you to understand that when you are starting the paper, it is vital for you to have a good start. Next, a very important factor which plays a huge role during your performance in the paper is the concentration factor. When you are starting the paper, typically your concentration level is somewhere here. It slowly starts increasing, drops, stabilizes there, towards the end starts dropping again. So, the initial few minutes and the final few minutes of the paper is, or rather are those instances of time when your concentration level is not at its peak. Now, let us understand why this happens. When you start the paper, what is happening? You are trying to settle down, you are anxious about what kind of questions will be appearing. So, normally your concentration level tends to be a bit low. Towards the end, what happens? You are quite tensed. You are like, okay, I do not know what I have done in the paper, and you have a constant timer there on screen which is showing a countdown. So, you tend to look at it more often rather than focusing on how to go about attempting the next question. So, your concentration towards the end again tends to be a bit low. Next, concentration also fluctuates when you move from one section to another section. Suppose I am solving QA and DI. The moment I am going to English and LR, because the section has changed, your concentration dips a little bit, because now you have to get used to a new type of or new pattern of questions. So, that is where concentration fluctuates. Second, concentration again fluctuates when you move from question to question. For example, if you are solving a reading comprehension question, it requires more concentration. If you are solving something like a fill in the blanks or a vocab based question, it takes less concentration. So, when I am trying to approach a paper like CAT, I need to keep all these factors in mind. Another very important part of this strategy bit is your time management. Are you managing to do justice to the time that you are spending? Now, it's very critical for you to understand that if I have 30 questions with a breakup of roughly 20-10, so 1/3 of the paper is about DI in this section, 2/3 is about QA. So, if I have 70 minutes with me, how much time should I be allocating to each part? That again becomes a point of concern. Now, before I move about discussing how I would typically attempt the paper, let us quickly understand what are the hurdles to time management. Why do we sometimes mismanage time? At times at the end of the test, you might start thinking, oh, maybe I should have spent more time somewhere else. Somehow you got stuck somewhere or the other. So, why is this happening? Let us understand that. One of the biggest hurdle to time management is the temptation factor. Now, what do I mean by the temptation factor? Let's see, take an example. Okay, say geometry is your favorite topic and you love doing geometry. Now, when you started off this section, you come across a question of geometry. What do you feel? You feel immediately tempted to attempt that particular question. Why? Because it's your favorite question or your favorite topic. Now, that question might be one of the toughest questions, but you simply refuse to move on. It's like, okay, I've already spent 2 minutes, another 2 minutes, I'll get the question. After 2 minutes are over, 4 minutes gone, again you feel I've already spent 4 minutes, 2 more minutes. So, you get stuck there, you refuse to just move on. Okay. So, you get tempted to stick to those questions where you feel is your favorite, but it might be actually quite a tough question. So, you might be losing out on some easier ones which might be featuring later on. Another hurdle to time management is not knowing where to start the paper. That is, maybe you started off with QA and then you suddenly find that it's not working out too well, then you suddenly shift to DI, then you feel okay, no, maybe QA is better. So, this kind of juggling around also hampers your time management. So, when I am going to be approaching this paper, I am going to keep all these factors in my head before I start off. Now, as I have been analyzing my papers, I have realized one thing, that DI happens to be a very good section for me, and whether my concentration is very high or whether it's very low, it doesn't make too much of a difference. It actually is, my performance is consistent throughout. So, now what do I do? Should I start with DI? Should I start with QA? When I see DI as a section, you find questions are more calculative by nature. Now, if questions are more calculative by nature, understand one thing very clearly, I do not require a very high concentration level to calculate, and calculations are much faster, they are more accurate. So, maybe within a shorter time span, you can attempt a lot more questions as compared to QA. So, imagine the kind of start that it gives me. If I can have a couple of questions under my belt in the first 5 to 8 minutes, I feel much more confident about the paper. So, I would typically start off this section with DI. Now, I will go about solving DI, and after that I will come to my quantitative aptitude section. I will try to follow this kind of an approach, because DI gives me a good start, it gives me a positive feeling about the paper, and once I get a positive feeling about the paper, it is like, okay, this is my paper, I am going to crack this paper today. So, that is the kind of confidence that you need to be generating right from the beginning. Similarly, when I am going to the second section, in English, there are questions based on vocab and grammar, which actually doesn't require you to solve them. So by default, the speed is higher. So when I'm shifting over to the next section, concentration typically tends to fall. So I will pick up these vocab based question or grammar based question and start off English. Then I'll go on to reading comprehension, where my concentration level is increasing, because reading comprehension typically takes more time than the word usage or grammar bit. Then I will go on to LR. So that would be my entire approach. Now, when I'm having this kind of an approach to the paper, I had spoken to you about the hurdles to time management, like the temptation factor and all. How do I get rid of this temptation factor? A simple thumb rule for you: whenever you're getting tempted to attempt, or you're getting stuck in a particular question, just keep telling yourself, I have time, I'll come back to this later. Always remember, in CAT, there's an option for marking a question. So on the first glance, if you feel that it's going to be time consuming, just mark that question and move on. Later on, there's a review page. So when you go to that review page, you will have a, in a snapshot, like an Excel sheet, which all questions have you answered, which is not answered, and which is marked. So whichever question you have marked for answering later, just do a double click on that, you go directly to that question. So the objective is not to get stuck in any particular question. You see, it's like a vicious circle. You'll spend 2 minutes, after 2 minutes you'll feel, let me spend another 2 minutes, it will get over. You are spending 4 minutes. After 4 minutes are over, you feel, okay, I've already spent 4 minutes, let me spend another 2 minutes. Now that which you started off with 2 minutes has gone up to 6 minutes, and now you're still not being able to solve the question. Now the pressure is mounting up on you. So remember, do not get stuck. If you think it's going to be time consuming, you're not getting the idea, just mark it. You can always come back to it later.